Story 1. When you work in law enforcement, you get used to seeing things that stick with you, things that don't always make sense, things you don't always have answers for. This particular case still lingers in my mind, not because it was dramatic or high stakes, but because of the sheer weight of the silence surrounding it. I was on patrol at the time, years before I became a detective. It was a quiet shift in a rural area, farmland, stretches of empty road, isolated houses spaced miles apart. Dispatch called about a welfare check. A neighbor hadn't seen the man who lived in the house for a couple of years. Not weeks, not months, years. Why it had taken so long to report, I couldn't say. Out in the countryside, people tend to keep to themselves. But still, the sheer length of time raised my eyebrows. When we pulled up to the house, the first thing I noticed was how lifeless it looked. The windows were opaque with black mold, their surfaces crawling with flies. The car sat in the garage, tucked away like it hadn't been moved in ages. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no kicked-in doors, nothing to suggest foul play at first glance. But the silence was palpable. It felt thick, oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like even your own movements are too loud. My partner and I exchanged a glance before breaching the door. The smell hit us like a wall the moment we stepped inside. I've been to crime scenes, I've dealt with decomposition, but this was something else. The air was thick with the stench of mold, dead flies, stagnant water, and something unmistakably human. It clung to the back of my throat, refusing to let go no matter how many shallow breaths I tried to take. The dining room was where we found him. He was lying on the floor, wrapped in a foam cord, beside a toppled chair. At first, it didn't even register as a body. He was mummified, his flesh melted into the carpet in a way that barely resembled a person anymore. His clothes gave him shape, but his features were unrecognizable. The heat of the room, combined with the burst pipes below, had turned everything into a grotesque, stagnant soup. It was suffocating, both the smell and the sight. The house itself was eerily tidy. The dining table was clean, aside from the dust that had settled over the years. In the kitchen, 2 neatly packed bags of groceries sat untouched on the floor, as if he'd planned to unpack them, but never got the chance. The fridge hummed quietly in the background, its contents long spoiled. No witnesses, no signs of struggle, no clear answers. We started piecing together what little we could. He was estranged from his family, hadn't spoken to them in years. His medical records indicated he had a heart condition, which led me to theorize he'd suffered a heart attack while trying to call for help. The phone cord tangled around him supported that idea. It looked like he'd pulled the chair over while reaching for the handset and collapsed before he could dial. But here's the thing that really unsettled me. His mailbox was overflowing with past due bills, notices of canceled utilities, the works. The last letter was dated 2 months prior, which meant the neighbor had waited until the mail practically spilled out onto the ground before reporting anything. 2 years in that house. 2 years of silence, of the house decaying around him, and no one thought to check until now. Then there was the cat. The man clearly had a cat. There were bowls of food and water near the back door, but there was no sign of its remains anywhere. Had it escaped? Wandered off? Or something else? I know it's a small detail, but the absence stuck with me. And the basement? I'll never forget the basement. The pipes had burst, leaving inches of stagnant water festering at the bottom of the stairs. Dead flies floated on the surface, their brittle bodies clustering at the edges. It was a perfect snapshot of decay, a place where time had frozen in the worst possible way. I spent weeks processing the scene, going over the details in my mind, trying to make sense of how someone could disappear like that without anyone noticing. The rural isolation played a role, sure, but it was the lack of human connection, the absence of concern that haunted me. Even now as a detective, I find myself thinking about that house. Not the gruesome parts, but the silence, the stillness, the way it felt like the world had simply stopped moving around him. It's a reminder of how easily someone can vanish, how quickly life can unravel, and how sometimes no one's there to see it happen. Story 2. It started with a call that didn't sound all that unusual. At first, A woman living in an apartment building near the outskirts of town had phoned in, claiming she was being watched by ghosts. Dispatch passed the information along to me and my partner with a shrug. "She's schizophrenic," they'd said. "Just do a wellness check and report back." Wellness checks were routine enough. Most of the time, it was just about reassuring someone, helping them feel safe in their home. But this one? It quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be the ordinary kind of call. The apartment complex was tucked away behind a stretch of old industrial buildings and crumbling parking lots, the kind of place you don't notice unless you're actively looking for it. And next door, an abandoned funeral home, its once elegant facade now peeling and covered in graffiti. It was the kind of building kids dared each other to break into, complete with broken windows and overgrown weeds wrapping around the base like the hands of time pulling it under. We knocked on the woman's door, and she answered almost immediately. She was in her late 40s, maybe early 50s, with messy hair and tired eyes that darted around nervously. Her first words, "They're watching me. I can feel them." We stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and old coffee. She led us to her living room, her hands shaking as she waved toward the window. "They're in there," she said, pointing at the funeral home next door. "I see them sometimes. Shadows, faces. They're keeping track of everything." I glanced at my partner, trying to mask my skepticism. "Do you think these are people?" I asked carefully. "No," she snapped, her voice sharp and certain. "They're not people. They're spirits, watching me, watching all of us." She gestured wildly at a notepad on the table, where she'd written her observations, scribbled notes about seeing movement at odd hours, hearing faint noises, and sensing that she wasn't alone. On the surface, it looked like the ramblings of someone caught in paranoia, but something about the way she described it, I don't know. It felt too deliberate, too detailed. We did a sweep of her apartment. Everything was in order, aside from her pile of notes and a few newspapers she'd used to black out the windows. But as we stood there, listening to her explain how she felt their eyes on her, I couldn't help but glance out the window at the darkened, yawning shell of the funeral home. My partner spoke first. "Let's take a look outside, he said, his tone more amused than concerned. He clearly thought it was all nonsense, but I wasn't as sure. Something about the whole setup didn't sit right with me. We made our way around the side of the apartment building, flashlights cutting through the shadows. The funeral home loomed ahead, its broken windows glinting faintly in the moonlight. The air felt colder there, sharper, as if it carried something the wind couldn't quite sweep away. And that's when we found it. There was a small side entrance to the funeral home, partially boarded up. The boards had been pried loose, just enough for someone to slip through. Inside, the air was stale and thick with decay, and the faint smell of something metallic lingered. My partner went in first, and I followed reluctantly. The place was a mess. Broken furniture, debris scattered across the floor, old mortuary equipment gathering dust in the corners. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find graffiti and maybe even squatters. But it was what we found upstairs that changed everything. In one of the old offices, we found a desk covered in notebooks. They weren't old or forgotten. They were recent, their pages filled with crude, handwritten logs. There were dates, times, and descriptions. Woman in apartment 3C leaves for work at 8:15 a.m. Man in 4A comes home at 6:30 p.m. Page after page chronicling the movements of the residents in the apartment building next door. My partner's face shifted, the humor draining from it. "This isn't," he started, trailing off as he flipped through another notebook. The logs weren't just detailed, they were obsessive. Whoever had written them had clearly spent hours, maybe days, watching the building. There were other things too. A pair of binoculars sitting on the windowsill, facing the woman's apartment, wrappers from protein bars, half a bottle of water, the kinds of things someone would bring if they were camping out for long stretches of time. The woman wasn't wrong about being watched. She'd just been right in a way none of us expected. We called it in, getting more officers and investigators on the scene. By the time we returned with a full team, though, the place was empty. Whoever had been there must have seen us coming or realized they'd been found out. They were gone, leaving only the notes and a few scattered belongings behind. The woman wasn't wrong. Someone, something had been watching her, keeping track of her, of everyone. Why? We never found out. The investigators never uncovered who had been using the funeral home or what their intentions were. My partner theorized they'd been planning some kind of crime, but fled when they thought they'd been discovered. To this day, I still think about those logs, about the eerie accuracy of the descriptions, the way they mirrored her paranoia almost perfectly, and about the fact that we might never know what they were really planning. Story 3. Investigating insurance claims wasn't a glamorous job, but it certainly had its moments of intrigue and occasionally moments of creeping dread. One of those moments happened during an arson case I worked on years ago in Birmingham, Alabama. The fire had taken place in the historic Masonic Temple, a towering 8-story Renaissance Revival building nestled in the historic Black business district downtown. It wasn't just the fire itself that was unsettling. It was what I found while combing through the charred remains. Built in the 1920s, the Masonic Temple was a monument to an era when Black entrepreneurs and professionals thrived in the area. The massive marble lobby and its grand second-floor ballroom had seen countless celebrations, fundraisers, and important gatherings over the decades. The building also housed offices for Black-owned businesses, from tailors to attorneys to the local NAACP chapter. But as the decades passed and integration came, the neighborhood experienced white flight, businesses moved out or shuttered altogether, and the building began its slow decline into emptiness. By the time I arrived, it was mostly abandoned, aside from the still-functioning masons and apparently squatters who'd sparked the fire. When I got the call to investigate, I didn't know much beyond the basics. Determine the cause of the fire, assess the damage, and see how far the destruction had spread. What I wasn't prepared for was the eerie silence that hung over the building. The electricity had been shut off by the fire department as a safety precaution, leaving the interior cloaked in darkness. It was up to me and my flashlight to navigate the sprawling structure. The second floor, the grand ballroom, had miraculously escaped damage. Walking into it felt like stepping back in time. The intricate millwork, elegant decor, and massive chandeliers were untouched, waiting patiently for a party that would never come. I took a moment to admire its grandeur before pressing on to the third floor. The offices on the third floor were mostly intact, still holding on to their mid-century furniture, some of which was in pristine condition. I came across desks layered with dust, filing cabinets left frozen in time, and the remnants of lives once busy with work and ambition. But as I climbed higher, something shifted. The building grew darker, literally and figuratively. The fourth floor was the first to make me hesitate. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom as I moved down narrow hallways, sweeping the beam across abandoned rooms. In one office, I found an old NAACP space, perfectly preserved as though someone had locked the door and left decades ago. Papers and files lined the drawers untouched, waiting. I lingered for a moment before venturing down the hall, my nerves buzzing. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, obscured by shadows, was a large looming structure. My flashlight barely illuminated it, just enough to make out its shape. Slowly, cautiously, I moved closer, my heart pounding with each step. Finally, the light revealed it fully, a coffin, an old Dracula-style coffin, standing upright at the end of the hall. I froze. My brain scrambled to rationalize its presence. Why would a coffin be here, in the middle of an empty office? I didn't dare touch it, didn't even want to get close enough to examine it. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it, and hurried to the stairwell. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just some strange remnant of a time long past. I kept climbing, floor after floor, and with each level the building felt heavier. The halls grew darker, the air colder, the sense of unease more intense. And the coffins? They weren't limited to the fourth floor. I found more. Some were out in the open, standing like monuments in the middle of offices. Others were tucked into closets or wedged against doors, blocking them from the inside. Every time I encountered one, I felt that same rush of unease, that same instinct telling me to keep moving. When I reached the top floor, the mystery became clearer and creepier. The two remaining businesses were revealed in faded signage, a coffin company and the Order of the Eastern Star. The OES Lodge gave me chills before I even entered its hallway. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I took a few quick pictures of the space before bolting back to the stairwell. By the time I reached the lobby, my nerves were shot. The only area left to inspect was the basement, a decision I didn't make lightly. But as I descended the stairs, I found something unexpected: a fallout shelter. Hundreds of barrels of water, food, medical supplies, radiation detectors, and more lined the space, perfectly preserved. It was a time capsule of a different era, tucked away in the darkness beneath the building. When I left the Masonic Temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that didn't want to be disturbed. The building was more than just a relic of history. It was a place where time had frozen, holding on to secrets and shadows that didn't belong to me. That investigation stuck with me long after the paperwork was done. The fire may have brought me there, but it was the silence and the strangeness of the temple itself that lingered. Some places carry a weight that doesn't fade, and the Masonic Temple in Birmingham is one of them. Story 4. The house wasn't particularly remarkable from the outside, just another dilapidated structure tucked away in the maze of a quiet neighborhood. But the thing about mob hideouts is they're rarely flashy. That's how you avoid attention. You blend in, unassuming, until someone finally figures out what's going on behind closed doors. And on this day, after months of undercover work, we had enough evidence to kick those doors open. We'd been tailing the crew for weeks, tracking their movements, listening to their conversations, gathering enough intel to justify a search warrant. The house was one of their frequented spots, a meeting place, a stash location, a place they clearly didn't want anyone snooping around. But as soon as we secured the warrant, we knew we had to act fast. The mob doesn't give second chances to anyone, including law enforcement. The first floor of the house was eerie, but it wasn't shocking. Furniture was sparse and mismatched, the kind of thing you'd expect in a place where people only spent time out of necessity. There were signs of activity: empty beer bottles, ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts, crumbs on the table, but nothing that screamed mob operation. It was the basement that changed everything. The door leading to the basement was heavy, reinforced with steel bars, the kind you'd expect in a bank vault, not a residential home. That was our first red flag. It took a couple of solid kicks to get it open, and as soon as the door gave way, the smell hit us. A wet, musty odor with something acrid mixed in. We knew right away we weren't just dealing with boxes of illegal goods. The staircase leading down was steep and narrow, and halfway down, the steps were submerged in water. It was murky, the kind that you couldn't see through even with the strongest flashlight. At first, it seemed like standard flooding. Maybe they'd neglected the plumbing, maybe the pipes had burst. But then we noticed the gouges. Long, jagged scratches ran along the walls on both sides of the staircase. They weren't random or accidental. They were deliberate, deep, the kind of marks that come from something with powerful claws or teeth. The doorframe at the top of the stairs was even worse, with chunks of wood splintered out, as if something had tried to claw its way out and failed. My partner shone his flashlight into the water, scanning the surface for signs of what might have caused the damage. At first, we didn't see anything. The water was too dark. But then the beam caught something metallic glinting just below the surface, like a reflection off of metal chains. That's when the unease started to settle in. This wasn't normal. None of this was. We decided to retreat back up the stairs and grab brighter flashlights from the truck outside. As we climbed, the claustrophobia of the narrow staircase mixed with the knowledge that something was horribly wrong. Those gouges weren't there by accident. Someone or something had been trapped down there. When we came back with brighter lights, the truth hit us like a punch to the gut. The water wasn't just murky, it was alive. As the flashlight beams sliced through the darkness, we saw them. Two massive crocodiles, their eyes glowing faintly in the light, their massive forms mostly hidden beneath the surface. They weren't just floating there, they were watching us. It didn't take long to piece together the story. The mob wasn't just using the house as a meeting spot, it was a place for punishment, a way to deal with anyone who crossed them. The gouges along the walls and the doorframe made it sickeningly clear. They'd lock people in the basement with the crocodiles, and if the victims tried to escape, well, the scratches showed how that played out. What's worse is that the gouges weren't clean. They had skin particles embedded in them. Whatever happened down there had been gruesome, violent, and far beyond anything I'd imagined when we first stepped into that house. We called in animal control and backup, but the sheer thought of standing at the edge of that basement, knowing what had taken place there, was enough to make my skin crawl. The house was a tomb of unspeakable acts, the kind of thing that sticks with you long after the cases close. Even now I can picture those gouges, those glowing eyes in the water, the heavy silence of a place where cruelty was routine. That was one of the craziest cases I've ever worked. Creepy doesn't even begin to cover it. Some things you don't forget, no matter how much you try. Story 5. When we got the call, it wasn't all that unusual. Reports of a bad smell coming from a home, likely someone who'd passed away and gone unnoticed for days. As part of forensics, I'd been on scenes like this before, but nothing about this case could have prepared me for what we walked into. The home itself was a modest, quiet place, tucked away in an average neighborhood. Not the kind where you'd expect anything out of the ordinary. Neighbors had complained about the odor, which led police to knock on the door. When no one answered, they entered. What they found inside prompted them to call us. I arrived with my team, the smell hitting like a physical wall the moment we stepped inside. It's a smell you can't forget. Death mixed with stagnant water and rot. We followed the officers to the bathroom, where the sight of the man stopped us cold. He was sitting in the tub, leaning slightly to one side, his legs folded awkwardly. He hadn't drowned. He'd boiled. At first, it didn't make sense. But after piecing together the details, we started to understand what had happened. The man was in his 40s, living alone. He'd gone out drinking, likely for Carnival, the kind of wild festival that Germans and Dutch folks would instantly recognize. Judging by the scene, he'd come home, still heavily intoxicated, and decided to take a bath. Here's where the nightmare began. He must have turned on the hot water knob, only the hot water, and then passed out drunk in the tub. The water kept running, filling the tub, getting hotter and hotter as time passed. Without anyone there to stop it, the man was literally boiled to death, his skin blistering and melting in the heat. By the time we found him, his skin had turned into something unrecognizable, a slippery layer barely clinging to what was left. When the team tried to remove him from the bath, the horror escalated. His skin started peeling, slipping off in sheets as they attempted to lift him. It wasn't just gruesome, it was deeply unsettling. We couldn't just move him like we would in other cases. Every part of him seemed ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. And here's the kicker. Our department had a picture of this scene. They used it in one of our lectures to demonstrate how extreme decomposition and environmental factors can alter the body. It's etched in my memory forever, not just for its graphic nature, but because it was such a bizarre, tragic way to go. No one noticed until the smell gave him away. No family, no friends, just a man boiled alive and forgotten. I've seen my share of unsettling cases, but this one sticks with me. It wasn't just the gruesomeness of it, it was the sense of isolation, the horrifying realization that something like this could happen so easily. It's not something you ever forget. Story 6. The 1990s were an interesting time for technology. Back then, memory wasn't something you just popped into a card and bought without blinking at the price. RAM sticks, those little pieces of hardware that powered everything in a computer, were absurdly expensive, running about $50 to $75 per megabyte. People think storage is precious now, but back then, every single megabyte mattered, which is why the theft I ended up involved in still baffles me to this day. I wasn't a detective. I was the tech guy they called when they didn't understand something about computers or needed help piecing things together in an investigation. My job wasn't glamorous, but it let me get my hands on cases that most people never even knew about. This one, though? This one was strange. I got the call from a friend in law enforcement one afternoon. They needed someone with a decent understanding of computer systems for a weird case involving a local university's lab. Weird in what way? I asked. He sighed and said, You'll see. That was all the introduction I got before I showed up at the scene. The computer lab wasn't anything fancy, just a long room filled with bulky desktop computers, all humming away under the glare of fluorescent lights. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and dusty books, the kind of environment you'd expect to find in the corner of a university library. Nothing seemed amiss at first glance, but when the lead officer walked me through what had happened, I started to see why they called me in. Apparently, someone had broken into the lab over the course of several months, and systematically tampered with the machines. The thief hadn't stolen monitors or keyboards or anything big and obvious. No, they'd opened up each computer, one by one, and swapped out its RAM sticks. For those unfamiliar, RAM is the short-term memory that computers rely on to function. And back then, it was incredibly valuable. Each machine originally had 4 megabyte RAM sticks installed, top of the line for that era. But whoever had done this replaced them with cheaper, lower capacity 1 megabyte sticks. Here's the kicker. No one noticed. You'd think a performance drop in a computer lab full of students would raise a red flag, right? But between the gradual decline in speed and the general tolerance of tech glitches back then, it flew under the radar. People just chalked up slower computers to buggy programs or outdated hardware. The theft went unnoticed until a routine maintenance check months later revealed the swap. The window for the crime was bafflingly broad. The university determined the tampering must have taken place sometime between September 1st and January 10th, a span of over 4 months. No one had reported anything unusual during that time, and the lab wasn't equipped with door keycard systems or cameras. Security, as it turned out, relied heavily on faith. The most unsettling detail was how methodical the thief had been. Opening up computers isn't a fast process, even less so in the 90s. It's not just popping a lid, it's screws, clips, cables, and careful maneuvering. To do this to a dozen machines without leaving any visible damage or arousing suspicion, that took patience, precision, and familiarity with the systems. As I examined the computers, looking for any sign of fingerprints or leftover tools, something occurred to me. This wasn't about greed. RAM sticks were valuable, sure, but there were easier ways to make money if someone wanted to steal. No, this felt meticulous, like the person who did it was more interested in the act itself than the payout. We started digging deeper into who might have had access to the lab. Students, faculty, maintenance staff. It was a wide net to cast, especially with no suspects and no physical evidence. The lack of cameras meant we had no faces to match with the timeline. Even the act of breaking into the lab itself was a mystery. The doors were usually locked after hours, but there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever it was either had a key or had figured out a way to bypass the lock entirely. The scariest part was how anonymous it all felt. Technology leaves traces, IP addresses, keystrokes, access logs, but this person managed to move through the space like a ghost. They left no fingerprints, no footprints, no clues about who they were or why they did it. For all we knew, they could have been one of the students, sitting in class next to the very machines they tampered with. The investigation hit a wall fast. Without suspects, we had no one to question. Without footage or clear evidence, we couldn't pin down a motive. The stolen RAM sticks never resurfaced, and the replaced ones were generic enough that they could have come from anywhere. The trail was cold before it even started. We ended up filing the case as unsolved, though the university beefed up its security after that. They installed cameras and keycard systems, too late to catch the original thief, but enough to deter copycats. The lab went back to business as usual, and the slow computers were gradually upgraded, erasing the remnants of the crime altogether. But I never stopped thinking about it. Not just because of how bizarre it was, but because of what it represented. How easy it is for someone to slip through the cracks, to manipulate a system without leaving a trace. Whoever did this wasn't just good at what they did. They were patient, deliberate, and maybe even a little obsessive. Story 7. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it was over 5 years ago. I was on duty manning the TAC radio in Broward County at around 3 a.m. The humid Florida air did little to warm the deserted stretch of highway where we eventually received the call. It wasn't uncommon for our shifts to be quiet, but that night, something played on my nerves from the very start. I was sitting in the sweltering pre-dawn darkness when the dispatch crackled over the radio. Unit 12, respond to a multiple vehicle collision on I-95 near exit 37. Reports indicate an 18-wheeler struck a box truck as it was coming off the exit. Over. The message came through cool and clinical, yet I could feel my pulse begin to quicken. We'd heard about plenty of accidents on that highway before, but the specifics had a grim tone I couldn't ignore. I activated my lights and sped toward the scene. The highway was barren, the only sounds the low rumble of my cruiser and the intermittent chirp of the radio. As soon as I arrived, I knew something wasn't quite right. The wreckage was far worse than a run-of-the-mill collision. An 18-wheeler had slammed into a box truck with such force that it chopped the smaller vehicle in half. Flames were licking at the twisted metal and shattered glass, and the roar of the burning truck fractured the eerie silence. Officers, firefighters, and units from 3 different jurisdictions were already arriving. I parked my cruiser alongside the chaotic scene, stepping out into the acrid stench of burning rubber and spilling diesel. My flashlight and badge in hand, I approached one of the on-scene officers who was coordinating the rescue efforts. "What's the status?" I asked. The officer's face was grim. "We've got 3 people trapped inside that truck, sir. It nearly exploded when the impact hit. They're in there, caught by the wreckage, and the fire's closing in." I could see the fear in his eyes even as he tried to remain calm. That's when the call came through on the radio, a frantic plea from one of the units. Rescue personnel had just reported a witness account. A man had been seen at the scene, a quiet figure who helped extricate the victims from the burning vehicle. According to the witness statements, the injured passengers were in dire need of help. One of them described being dragged from the wreckage by a man in plain clothes. They said he had pulled them from the inferno, gently laying them on the side of the road on a strip of asphalt that still sizzled from the heat of the fire. The story was odd enough to be almost unbelievable, but with the stakes so high, every detail was crucial. As the chaos unfolded, units swarmed the scene. Firefighters battled the blaze, ambulances loomed with their sirens off, and police officers cordoned off the area. When the time came to check on every person involved in the accident, someone from the fire department, one of our more veteran firefighters, noticed something peculiar. I remember watching him as he grabbed the arm of the man who had rescued the occupants. He was about to ask for identification, maybe even a statement about how the rescue had happened, when the firefighter turned around. In that moment of split-second recognition, the man just vanished. I'll never forget the look on my colleague's face. His eyes widened, and he muttered something under his breath about not miffing with ghosts. A chill ran down my spine. We even dispatched additional units to scour the area for any sign of the rescuer, checking behind vehicles and along the roadside. But it was as if the man had never been there at all. No fingerprints, no footprints, nothing. I rounded on another officer. "Did anyone catch his description?" "What did he look like?" The officer replied, "He wasn't wearing a uniform or anything, just plain clothes, and he seemed calm. The survivors say he guided them to safety, but when we tried to find him, he was gone. It's like he was just a spirit." I found myself questioning everything I'd seen in my years on the force. Broward County had its share of bizarre cases, but this defied logic. The notion that someone could appear, help 3 people out of a burning vehicle, and literally vanish into the night was something straight out of a ghost story. I kept replaying the radio calls and the frantic testimonies in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if we had just encountered something or someone that wasn't wholly of this world. At that moment, the entire crash scene became even more surreal. I recalled the expressions on the survivors' faces: relief, confusion, and an eerie calm as if they were in a daze. When later interrogated by our team, one of the survivors said, "He didn't say a word. I just felt safe with him there. He was there 1 minute and then he was gone." His voice trembled, but he insisted it was exactly as it happened. Throughout the day, while units processed the scene and collected evidence from the twisted metal and charred remains, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something larger was at play. The incident was logged as a vehicle fire with entrapment, a tragic accident that, by all accounts, should have been solved quickly by standard procedures. but that solitary phantom rescuer haunted my thoughts. I even went over our recordings multiple times, listening to every dispatch, every word. There was nothing to indicate any tampering or planted evidence. The only anomaly was the disappearance of that mysterious man. I spent the rest of the shift trying to piece together the timeline in my mind. I interviewed officers and firefighters trying to see if any one of them might have seen him again or had a better description, but every conversation led back to the same chilling conclusion. He was never seen again after that moment. I remember one of the senior detectives from a neighboring jurisdiction remarking dryly, "That's the weirdest thing I've ever seen on a collision scene." It wasn't a compliment, but it summed up the mystery perfectly. Back at headquarters, when I recounted the story to a few colleagues, I expected reactions of shock or even horror. Instead, many of them offered a nonchalant shrug, as if ghost stories were common currency among detectives. One rookie even chuckled and said, "Maybe he was just a good Samaritan in disguise," while another muttered, "Yeah, sure, like a guardian angel or some crap." But deep down, I knew what I had seen, or at least what everyone present insisted they had seen. That eerie figure had helped save lives and then evaporated into thin air, leaving nothing but questions and an inexplicable chill. Every now and then, when the late shift quiets down and the radio crackles in the dead of night, I hear that same static whisper reminding me of that vanishing rescue. I wonder if that man was real, a genuine hero who chose to remain an enigma, or if he was simply an illusion born from the chaos of a catastrophic accident. Either way, his absence left a mark on that night, a ghostly signature that I haven't been able to shake off. It was one of those cases that, while officially closed, continues to echo in your mind. Every time I pass by that stretch of highway on a quiet night or listen to attack radio's morse of emergency calls, I feel that same inexplicable shiver. And though the official paperwork is complete, and the files on that wreck have long since gathered dust, the memory of that night, the sound of flames, the screams of rescuers, and then that unexplainable disappearance remains vivid. Story 8. I remember that night like it was carved into my memory. A night when even the relentless cold of northern Canada couldn't freeze the terror that followed. I was on night shift in an isolated First Nations community up north, tasked with investigating what initially seemed like a routine domestic violence complaint. It was the middle of winter, so cold that the air itself felt like shards of glass, and my partner and I were dispatched on a tip-off based on a neighbor's report of a woman's scream. We had trudged through the biting wind, our breath visible in the frigid air, driving slowly along unmarked roads where houses were few and far between. On many reservations, the homes weren't numbered properly, which made pinpointing the exact location a challenge. Our radio crackled with static as we tried to get more details from the caller, but all we got was a terrified, halting description that left much to our imagination. All we knew was that there'd been a scream, and it seemed to come from somewhere along the line of a scattered row of dilapidated homes. After several minutes of aimless circling and strained discussions with our dispatcher, we finally heard an ear-splitting shriek that cut through the otherwise eerie silence. It was so raw and desperate that it froze us in our tracks. My partner's eyes met mine for a split second, a mix of shock and grim determination, and we headed straight toward the source. There, on a frost-bitten stretch of the community, stood a single-story prefabricated home that looked like it had seen better days. The wooden siding was faded with age, and icicles clung like sinister ornaments to its eaves. The front door hung slightly ajar, a precarious gap that suggested someone or something had extricated itself from within. All the lights were off, and any hint of life that might have been there was cloaked in a darkness that matched the winter night. We hurried up to the door. "Police, open up!" I barked through the gap, pushing my voice hard against the wind. I knocked on the door repeatedly, and my partner echoed my cries. Again and again we called out. There was no response, just that unsettling, oppressive silence on the other side. The lack of any answer set us both on edge. If someone had truly been in distress, they'd have answered at least in a whisper. Fearing for whoever might be inside, we slowly eased the door open wider. I grabbed my flashlight and, with the officer's practiced caution, I announced, "Detectives here! Open up!" Into the opening. Still nothing. Heart pounding, I exchanged a brief nod with my partner, and together we stepped gingerly into the abandoned foyer. The interior was a disorganized chaos. Overturned trash bins, scattered remnants of old newspapers, and broken children's toys lay strewn across a floor that was as far from immaculate as the worst of crime scenes could be. The smell of damp decay mingled with a faint hint of something metallic, perhaps old blood or rust. Every step felt precarious, my eyes constantly darting around, half expecting to see the unthinkable. A body mangled and obscured beneath heaps of garbage. I couldn't shake the disquiet that maybe someone or something might have been hidden away in that mess. "Partner, be careful," I cautioned, my voice low and steady as we advanced further into the pitch-black dwelling. Our only sources of light were the harsh beams from our flashlights, which we swept methodically over the cluttered space. I first swept the beam to the left, where all I saw was more garbage and debris. Every step revealed nothing but decay, the collapsed remnants of a once lived-in home. Then I slowly panned my flashlight to the right. That's when I saw something white catch the beam's glare. I froze. In the distant gloom, about 10 feet away amid the debris and discarded items, stood a small figure. I squinted, heart pounding violently in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. The figure was that of a small girl, no older than 10, silhouetted against the darkness. She was wearing a white sleeping gown, the kind that looked like it belonged to another generation, long out of fashion since our grandmothers were young. The fabric was stained and worn, a snapshot of neglect and decay. Time seemed to suspend as I stared at her. Her head was slumped forward, and her greasy, unkempt hair was matted across her face, obscuring any features that might have offered an explanation. For a moment, I thought of that horror flick, The Ring, and wondered if I'd just stepped into one of those cursed settings. I expected to see some electronic static or ominous background detail behind her, but all I saw was a shadowy figure standing amid refuse in the failing light of my flashlight. "Ma'am? Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the grimy walls. The sound startled me. The word "ma'am" seemed so out of place in the context of what I was witnessing. I took a slow step forward, trying to cover the distance between myself and this eerie apparition. The girl didn't react at first. She didn't move, nor did she speak. I could see her body swaying ever so slightly, as if caught in a weak breeze that had no place indoors. I raised my voice. "Hello? Are you okay?" My tone was louder now, carrying genuine concern mixed with a tremor I couldn't hide. Suddenly, as if roused by my approach, the girl jerked her head up abruptly. Her eyes, that momentary spark of life, locked onto mine. And then, without warning, she screamed. It was a piercing, gut-wrenching sound that seemed to come from deep somewhere. A scream that was more than just a child's cry. It was raw terror. I recoiled instinctively, the sound reverberating in my ears while my partner stood frozen beside me, his face wan and unreadable. The scream filled the small, cluttered room, making the very walls seem to shake. I could feel the chill of it, an icy dread that seeped into my bones. After that agonizing moment, the girl's head slumped again, and she resumed her static, unnatural stance, as though the brief spark of recognition had been stolen away by the scream itself. "Did you see?" my partner mumbled, his words barely a whisper, as if afraid to break the oppressive silence that followed. I approached her carefully, my flashlight beam wavering slightly as I tried to focus on her face, hoping to see something, any sign of who she was or what might have happened to her. But even up close, her features remained shrouded in shadows and grime. She neither moved nor spoke. The horrifying glimpse of life in that dark room had already been etched into my mind with indelible clarity. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to speak again. "Hey, it's okay, we're here to help." I took another tentative step forward, but the girl simply stood still. Her eyes, then closed again, offered no explanation, no understanding, merely a void of silence that deepened the mystery rather than alleviating it. Time slowed, and in that dismal interior, every second stretched into an eternity of unease. I was torn between my duty as a detective, my need to ensure the safety of someone who might be in peril, and the gnawing terror that what I was witnessing was beyond ordinary logic. With the stench of neglect and decay hanging heavily around us, I felt a deep instinctive urge to retreat. But I couldn't just leave a screaming child, or whatever she might represent, in such dire straits. "Partner, should we?" I started, but I didn't finish the sentence. Her sudden blood-curdling scream had already become more than enough to push any rational thought aside. The scream was genuine and paralyzing enough that it forced an immediate decision. We had to get out, now. I stepped back abruptly, fumbling for my radio to call for backup, while my partner flinched as if even the slightest movement might wake something far worse. Our flashlights bobbed in the chaos as we retreated toward the door, the sound of that tortured scream echoing in our minds long after we crossed the threshold and closed the door behind us. Outside, the unforgiving winter wind seemed to mock the brevity of our encounter. The chill of that cold night could not compete with the lingering shock of what we had seen. A small girl, draped in a filthy, outdated sleeping gown, whose sudden outburst of terror shattered the silence of an already haunted, desolate home. We didn't speak much on the ride back to our patrol car. Words felt inadequate, nearly sacrilegious to the inexplicable horror of that moment. Even now, many years later, when I find myself alone on a cold night shift or passing by an abandoned house in a forgotten part of a reservation, I can almost hear that scream, a sound that defies explanation. Was she a victim of some terrible fate in that impoverished, neglected home? Or was she a ghost, a remnant of trauma beyond the realm of the living? I'm still not sure. All I know is that, in my line of work, I've faced cases that would make most people shudder. But nothing ever quite prepares you for a moment when the darkness itself seems to breathe, when a scream from the void confirms that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not of human making. That night, in that forsaken home, I encountered something that remains unexplainable. A moment that blurred the line between human vulnerability and something otherworldly. And while the case was closed with no clear answers, the image of that small, silent figure in a rain-soaked doorway continues to remind me that in the chill of a northern winter, some mysteries are best left unsolved. Story 9. I was wrapping up a quiet shift that humid night in midsummer when the call came in. I wasn't expecting anything more out of the ordinary, a routine disturbance or a drunk argument perhaps, but what we got changed everything. My partner Mike and our buddy Daniel and I had been investigating a domestic complaint in an apartment on Cedar Street. The caller, a young woman whose name I later learned was Leah, claimed that her apartment was haunted. I scoffed at the idea at first. Ghosts weren't exactly on our agenda. But by the time we got to the scene, it was clear that something bizarre was unfolding. We parked our cruiser a few blocks away in a rough part of town, not exactly the kind of place where one expected ghost stories to come true, but then again, you never knew what you might find on these calls. Mike, always the pragmatic one, read the address off his radio while Daniel and I exchanged knowing looks. Daniel, who had a habit of getting a bit too interested in every case, especially one with a supernatural twist, shot me a conspiratorial grin. I could tell right away that he was intrigued by Leah's story, and by Leah herself. I stepped out first, flashlight in hand, feeling the night's chill prick at my skin even though it was barely warm enough for summer in our part of the world. The apartment building was an aging brick structure, its exterior scarred by time and neglect. The door to Leah's unit was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in with an unspoken challenge. I knocked firmly, announcing our presence. "Detectives! Open up!" But the door creaked open slowly to reveal an empty, dimly lit hallway. That's when we heard it, a high-pitched, almost inhuman shriek echoing faintly down the corridor. Daniel's eyes caught mine. He'd seen something in that sound that made his face tighten. Mike went silent for a moment, his jaw set in a grim line, and I felt the familiar sensation of being pulled into a case that defied explanation. We exchanged a quick nod and decided to step inside. The interior of the apartment was cramped and sparsely furnished. Flimsy furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a pervasive must that hinted at years of neglect. It wasn't glamorous by any standard, but it had character, if you were the type to appreciate old, haunted relics. Leah was waiting for us in the living room, a small, unassuming space cluttered with discarded magazines and a single threadbare couch. When she saw us, her eyes went wide, and for a moment, she looked almost relieved. "Thank goodness you're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. I could see that she wasn't simply playing up a domestic squabble. There was genuine fear in her eyes. Before I could ask her to explain, Mike casually said, "Ma'am, we got your call about some disturbances. Can you tell us exactly what's been going on?" Leah hesitated, her eyes darting toward the darkened corners of the room. It's not like any argument I've ever heard. It was a voice, a demonic voice. That wasn't mine. I heard it coming from my neighbor's apartment." She paused as if trying to collect her thoughts. "Last night I was upstairs, and suddenly I heard him shouting. Not shouting in anger, like he was possessed. It was horrifying, like something out of a nightmare." Daniel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Did you see him?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "I didn't go out. I just heard it. But later, when I tried to call him, the door was open and I heard him say things I can't even repeat." At this point, despite my habit of leaning on common sense and routine investigative procedures, I couldn't help feeling that this case was taking on an edge of unreality. Mike scribbled some notes in his pad, while Daniel's eyes shone with a mix of excitement and something else. Maybe worry, because he'd already mentioned, in a hushed tone before we left the station, that he found Leah intriguing. That personal interest, while unprofessional, made his involvement all the more dangerous in a case like this. After taking her statement, we decided to investigate further. We asked Leah if she would accompany us to her neighbor's apartment. She hesitated but finally agreed. The walk down the narrow corridor between the units was tense. The lights overhead flickered weakly, and every sound was amplified in the heavy quiet of the building. When we reached the door of the neighbor's unit, number 12, it was shut tight. Mike knocked loudly. "Police!" he called out, then waited. No answer. We knocked again, harder. At last, the door swung open a crack, and for a moment, we saw a slender figure standing in the doorway. An older man with hollow eyes and a vacant expression. I stepped forward and identified ourselves. "Detectives, we're following up on a complaint of disturbances. We need to ask you a few questions." But before he could speak, a low, guttural sound emanated from somewhere inside the apartment. The man's eyes flickered with something indescribable, a mix of rage and terror, before shutting the door in our faces. It was a fleeting movement, but it sent a shiver down my spine. We regrouped in the hallway. Daniel muttered, "Did you see that?" He just changed completely, in a heartbeat. Mike frowned, and I could see the tension creeping into his features. We decided that we'd come back later after giving the man some space. We then returned to Leah's apartment to reassess our gathered information. That's when everything went to hell. Later that night, as we were leaving the building, Mike's radio burst to life with a frantic message from one of our backup units. "We've got a report. The neighbor is..." He's shouting, and it's not normal shouting. It's demonic. Over. The voice on the radio was shaky, on edge. Without hesitation, we raced back into the building. Daniel and I led the way to the neighbor's apartment, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. We could hear faintly at first an unnatural cacophony of voices. Then as we approached the open door of Unit 12, we heard it, a sound so horrifying it nearly paralyzed us. The neighbor was now standing in the middle of a poorly lit living room, his face contorted, his voice resounding in a deep, monstrous timbre that clearly wasn't his own. I stepped forward, hand hovering near my sidearm, and demanded, "Sir, stop!" The sound halved the silence, echoing off the bare walls. For several agonizing seconds, he didn't answer, but continued in that otherworldly tone. Then, as if coming to a sudden clarity, he stopped. His eyes cleared momentarily, and he looked at us with a horror that was unmistakably human. I am an ancient deity," he stammered, his voice reverting to normal, but the words hung heavy in the otherwise silent room. At that moment, everything clicked into a surreal montage. Daniel, still visibly shaken, could only gape silently. Mike, who'd already been entranced by Leah's vulnerability, now looked on in silent disbelief at the bizarre transformation and the man's cryptic confession. I felt the weight of the situation crush me. A domestic dispute had devolved into something that bordered on occult horror. I quickly commanded, "Step back. We need you to calm down and come with us." But the man stood there, eyes wide, as if trapped between two worlds, a frail old soul and a force not of this earth. Then, without any further explanation, the neighbor's features went blank, his eyes empty. In that same moment, he bolted out of the room and vanished into the dark corridor. We scrambled to follow him, but he had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the sound of our thudding footsteps. Back in Leah's apartment, we had little time to process before Leah began to cry softly. She whispered, "I knew something was wrong with him. I always felt an evil presence when I was around his place." Mike tried to comfort her, but I knew we had crossed a line with this case. We'd seen something that defied all ordinary explanation. A man caught mid-transformation, claiming to be something ancient and otherworldly, then vanishing into thin air. We filed the report that night like any other case, but I could tell by the looks on my partner's faces that none of us would ever forget what we witnessed in that building. The neighbor was never found again, and though we attempted follow-up investigations for weeks, the trail went cold. No one else reported similar disturbances, and Leah eventually moved out, leaving behind more questions than answers. I still get mixed reactions when I tell this story. Some laugh it off as a tall tale, others shake their heads in disbelief. But I know what I saw. That night, in that dilapidated apartment in a rundown building on Cedar Street, the line between human terror and something unexplainable blurred briefly, leaving us with a mystery that remains unsolved. For me, it was the single night when a routine call turned into a descent into the uncanny. A night that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I learned that sometimes the creepiest cases aren't those with cold, calculated killers. They're the ones where reality itself seems to warp into something other, something inexplicable, where neighbors become harbingers and ordinary disputes twist into echoes of ancient, dormant forces. It wasn't just about a ghost story or a case of domestic violence. It was a brush with something far older and far more terrifying than any of us could ever understand. Story 10. I didn't sign up for ghost stories when I joined Special Investigations in Chicago, but sometimes you get handed a case that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the city. I've seen plenty of brutal crimes in Chi-Town, murders that leave bodies nearly unrecognizable, robberies that baffle even the most seasoned detectives, but nothing prepared me for what we later dubbed the wolf killings. It all started with a series of grisly, wolf-like murders in neighborhoods that most folks wouldn't expect to see anything remotely supernatural. Victims, seemingly ordinary people with ties to various inner-city communities, were found savagely torn to pieces. At first, our division thought it was a street gang embracing a wolf motif, but the brutality and randomness of the killings defied any simple explanation. When we started cross-referencing the cases, a peculiar pattern emerged. Every victim had some connection, however slight, to an underground initiative known only as the Northwest Passage Project, a program spearheaded by a shadowy figure named McFinn. I remember the day we finally decided to pay McFinn a visit. We tracked him to a grim, nondescript building on the far side of town, a building that looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. I'd been working on these cases for years, and I'd learned not to get too comfortable with the gruesome details. But there was something about this project, the name, and the way it tied these murders together that set my skin on edge. My partner, Ramirez, and I, along with a couple of other guys from our unit, drove out to McFinn's place on a drizzly afternoon that felt as cold as winter in far northern Canada. We expected to find a hideout for some low-life cult or a place riddled with drugs and stolen goods. Instead, what we found was beyond anything I could have predicted. The building's exterior was unremarkable, a crumbling brick facade with boarded-up windows and a door that creaked open under the slightest pressure. We flanked it, guns drawn as we approached cautiously. I still recall the low murmur of boots on cracked concrete as we entered, our flashlights cutting weak beams through the musty dark. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of decay and something metallic I couldn't immediately place. "Keep your eyes peeled," Ramirez muttered as we crept into a narrow hallway. Our every step echoed in the silence until we came upon the evidence that would make this case so unforgettable. In one of the rooms under a flickering fluorescent light, we found the body of a young girl sprawled in a shallow pool of coagulated blood. She was no older than 16, maybe even a bit younger, and her lifeless eyes stared blankly upward. What made it all the more disturbing was the condition of her throat. It wasn't just cut, it was completely torn out, a grisly wound that exposed her spine. I felt an immediate bone-deep revulsion, even as my training told me to compartmentalize the horror and get on with the investigation. "Jesus," one of my colleagues whispered. I didn't answer. Instead, I took careful photos, trying to capture every detail, knowing these images would haunt me long after the case was closed. As we combed through the building, every room seemed to reveal more evidence of a macabre obsession. In the upstairs corridor, we found ritualistic markings on the walls, symbols and weird glyphs that none of us could decipher. But it wasn't until we descended into the basement that things got downright surreal. The basement was a dark, cavernous space that reeked of damp earth and rust. In the center of the room, carved directly into the concrete floor, was a large circle inlaid with a design that looked impossibly ancient. The circle was about 8 feet in diameter, a perfect ring of intricately braided gold, bordered by mysterious symbols etched into the stone. There were gems inlaid with silver and hints of design that looked as if someone had painstakingly pried it from the very ground, only to remold it into something else entirely. The strange writing that punctuated the edges made my skin crawl. It wasn't in any language I recognized. I turned to Ramirez, who was standing a few feet away, his face lit by the stark beam of his flashlight. "You ever seen anything like this?" I asked quietly. He shook his head, his voice low. "Never. It looks like something out of a nightmare. I don't know whether it's meant to ward something in or keep something out." At that moment, we decided to call in our go-to occult specialist, a guy named Tucker, who'd helped us decode a couple of cases in the past that brushed against the paranormal. Tucker arrived later that day, his wiry frame and intense eyes belying a mind steeped in occult lore. After examining the circle, his expression shifted from curiosity to unease. "This ring," Tucker said slowly, running a trembling finger over the carvings. "It's not some ordinary ritual mark. It's designed to keep something locked in, specifically werewolves." He paused for effect, and I could see our guys exchanging incredulous looks. I know it sounds insane, but everything about this setup, this material, the craftsmanship, the ancient script, it all points to techniques used in old folklore to contain shapeshifters. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Werewolves? In inner-city Chicago? It was ludicrous, right? And yet the evidence didn't lie. The pattern of the murders, the ferocity of the attacks, and now this circle, it was all beginning to form a mosaic that defied everyday explanation. Before I could ask any more questions, Tucker continued, "McFinn's Northwest Passage project. It might be an attempt to study or control something best left unknown. Perhaps he's involved in experiments or rituals meant to harness or contain predators of a kind we've only heard of in legends." My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a cult? A twisted scientific study? Or had someone somehow summoned relics of ancient myth to wreak havoc on Chicago's streets? Back at headquarters, as we compiled our reports and handed over evidence to the forensic team, the case took an even darker turn. Over the next few weeks, more people showed up with deaths that bore the unmistakable signature of wolf-like violence. Attacks that left victims savaged, their bodies torn apart in a manner that was more animalistic than human. Several of the suspects we eventually arrested were lowlifes with no connection to clandestine organizations. But the killings continued, and every time I looked at those grisly photos, I couldn't help but wonder. Were those arrests ever really the full story? Or were we dealing with something far older and far more insidious than a mere gang war? There were nights I'd patrol the darker corridors of Chicago, and I'd catch my reflection in the grime of some abandoned building and think of that circle in the basement. The engraving meant to hold something in. Even as we tied up more cases and locked down a few individuals with tenuous ties to McFinn's operation, I'd find myself doubting whether we'd truly close the case. Because sometimes when the city sleeps and the wind howls like distant wolves, I remember Tucker's words. I remember the savage tears in a victim's flesh, the rituals scribbled on old walls, and that circle, a monstrous emblem of a fight waged between ancient powers and modern man. One frigid December evening, after another string of wolf murders in a rundown part of the city, I found myself in my office staring at that photograph on my desk, a close-up of the golden ring with its cryptic inscriptions. I ran my finger over the edge of the photo, as if trying to feel the cold, hard stone beneath the image. And I wondered, if that circle was truly meant to keep something at bay, why had it failed? Had McFinn's project gone horribly wrong? Or worse, was someone unleashing what that circle was meant to contain? Every investigation since then has been laden with those questions. There were brief moments in the aftermath when I caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the glint of a wolf's eyes in the darkened alley. I spoke about it in hushed tones with Ramirez on our late-night drives home. He'd always say, maybe some things are just better left alone. And I couldn't disagree. We eventually managed to secure a few arrests, low-level affiliates who claimed they'd been involved in vaguely defined rituals connected to the Northwest Passage project. But deep down, I knew the heart of the mystery was still out there. The real force behind those monstrous, wolf-esque killings had never been found. In a city as vast and unfathomable as Chicago, where the ancient and the modern collide every day, it wasn't hard to believe that some doors were never fully closed. Now, whenever I walk past the old industrial district or see a faded symbol spray-painted on a forgotten wall, I remember that chilling case. I remember McFinn's name, that horrifying, meticulously carved circle, and the blood-stained face of a young girl among the casualties. And I still shudder, wondering if we really caught the culprits, or if the true horror remains out in the shadows, waiting for another chance to break through. I don't claim to have all the answers. In my years on the force, I've come to realize some mysteries are deeper than any police file, more unsettling than any court verdict. The wolf killings, the strange circle in McFinn's basement, and those inexplicable, brutal deaths. They haunt me as a reminder that sometimes reality is far darker than fiction. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.